Grace stood at her bedroom window, looking over the long green rows of the Martin vineyard. The late afternoon sun made everything look peaceful and expensive, but her hands shook on the silk of the wedding dress she didn't even want. 15 years of her life were out there in that soil, testing, planning, saving harvests, and today she was the one being handed over to keep it alive. 3 days earlier her father had sat her down in his dark office and said, in the same tone he used for investors, "The vineyard is $75 million in debt. We have 3 weeks before the bank takes it. David Vance has agreed to clear the debt. In exchange, he wants to marry you." Now, looking down at the white chairs and flowers in the courtyard, Grace didn't feel like a bride. She felt like part of a deal. She remembered that meeting like it was still happening. Her father, Robert Martin, had pushed bank letters across the desk. "Does this look like I'm joking?" he'd said. Her mother, Clara, had appeared in the doorway. Perfect hair, perfect dress, perfect criticism. "For once in your life, Grace, you'll be useful for something bigger than dirt reports," she'd said in that cold, gentle way. "You're 29, not a teenager. It's time you gave something real to this family." Grace had still been in her field clothes, dust on her boots, fingers stained from checking the North Block. She had wanted to tell them she was the one keeping the wine quality stable, not Chloe with her dresses and wine-tasting smiles. But 4 to 7 families worked on this land. If the vineyard fell, they fell too. So Grace swallowed her anger and told herself, this is just another task for the vineyard. The wedding looked like a dream to everyone else. The central courtyard was dressed in white, flowers everywhere, wine barrels polished, guests in shiny clothes. People whispered as Grace walked in on her father's arm. "She's so calm," someone said. No one knew her father had given her a choice that wasn't a choice, marry or let it all be taken. No one knew she'd once brought him a plan to make perfume from vineyard plants and he'd waved it away. As she walked toward the altar, Grace didn't think about love. She thought about payroll, about workers' children, about not letting the land get sold to people who didn't care. She held her head high. If she had to be traded, she would at least look unbreakable. David Vance stood waiting at the front. Tall, neat, eyes that watched everything. He didn't look in love. He looked ready. When he met her eyes, Grace saw something she didn't expect. Not kindness, not dislike, but calculation. Like he was checking to see if she could keep up. The minister talked about love and 2 hearts, but what Grace felt more than the ring was the weight of the agreement. Your life for this land. Her father squeezed her hand right before he let go, like he was handing over a file. David said his vows smoothly, like a man used to making deals. Grace said hers with the steady voice of someone who had already paid this price in her mind. Around them, people smiled. None of them saw it was a quiet exchange, not a love story. At the reception, her sister Chloe floated around in a pale dress, laughing too loudly, brushing David's arm whenever she could. Chloe was the face of the vineyard, the one in photos, the one who poured wine for visitors. Grace was the one in the dirt. Grace sat at the head table, choosing water instead of wine. She needed to think clearly. David didn't act like a happy groom. He moved through the crowd like someone studying a company, talking to old workers, greeting her father's business partners, remembering faces. Grace watched him and thought, he didn't just come here to rescue us. He came here for information. When he sat beside her, he said quietly, your family built a very pretty house over a very deep hole. Grace turned to him. You sound like you already knew that. He gave a small, careful smile. I did. That night, when everyone was gone and the vineyard was quiet again, they went to the guest house that looked out over the vines. David took off his tie, opened a bottle of their best wine, and the polite groom look dropped from his face. Did you know your father didn't always own most of this place? He asked. Grace frowned. What do you mean? He handed her old copies of papers. 25 years ago, another man owned the bigger share. My grandfather. His name was Samuel Croft. He wanted to run the vineyard another way. Then he died in an accident, and your parents ended up with everything. Grace stared at him. Why tell me this now? David met her eyes. Because I didn't marry you for romance, he said plainly. I married you to get inside this family. I need the truth about what happened to my grandfather. And I think you need the truth about your parents. They spread the old letters on the small table, yellowed and neat. David read parts out loud. He warned your father about a pesticide the state was already watching, David said. He said he'd report it. 2 weeks later he was dead under a tractor. Grace felt the cold run through her. That was the same year I saw weird changes in the early soil tests, she whispered. I thought it was just bad decisions.
David shook his head. My grandfather wasn't careless.
Someone wanted to keep using cheap, bad stuff. Someone wanted him gone. Grace looked up slowly. My father never let me change to sustainable methods, she said. I thought it was because he didn't trust me. David tapped the letters. Maybe it was because he was hiding the past.
For the first time, Grace didn't feel like a prisoner bride.
She felt like someone who'd just been handed the start of the real story. Grace stared at one paragraph.
He talks about distilling things, she said. About making sense from the vineyard plants.
That's exactly what I wanted to do. David's eyes sharpened. Then they didn't just take his shares, he said. They buried his idea. Grace walked to the window, looking at the vines in the dark.
All these years I thought my mother just didn't respect me, she said quietly.
What if she was making sure no one ever found out this was his idea first? David leaned forward. Then we find proof, he said. Old maps. Old rooms. Anything hidden. Families that steal land usually hide paper too. Grace turned back, something fierce in her now. I know every inch of this vineyard, she said. If something is hidden here, I can find it. At dawn they went out, when the vines were still wet. Grace led David to the old corner of the property her father always called too rocky to clear.
She had never questioned that before. Now she did.
They pushed through wild vines until David stopped. Grace, here. Half buried under leaves was a wooden trapdoor with rusted metal.
Grace's heart kicked. This shouldn't be here, she whispered. Together they pulled it open. Cold, old air slid past them.
I'll go first, Grace said, taking the flashlight.
The steps creaked as she went down.
At the bottom, her light swept across glass tubes, bottles, dried plants hanging from the ceiling.
Her breath caught. This isn't a cellar, she called.
It's a lab. David joined her, shining his light on notebooks. Grace opened one. Inside were perfume formulas, extraction notes, all from vineyard plants, the same thing she'd tried to pitch.
Her voice broke.
He saw the same future I did.
David put a hand on her shoulder.
Then this place is ours now, he said.
And it's where we work. From then on, they lived two lives.
In public, Grace was the new wife. Helping her husband understand distribution, smiling at her mother's lunches, answering her father's sharp questions. In secret, she and David met in the hidden lab, sorting journals, matching dates, building a timeline.
Clara started watching them more closely.
One night at dinner she smiled too much and asked, David, tell me again where you studied.
I can't quite place your background.
Robert watched him like a hawk. David answered smoothly, never mentioning the name Croft. After dinner, Grace shut the guest house door and let out a breath. They are starting to suspect, she said. David nodded. Then we speed up, he said. We need the papers in your father's office.
We need proof about the tractor.
And we need to act like nothing is wrong. Grace straightened, the scared bride gone.
Fine, she said.
We'll let them think they still control us, while we dig up everything they tried to bury.
The pressure in the house started to rise. Robert began dropping by offices he never entered before.
Clara started asking where Grace spent her afternoons. Even Chloe, who usually cared only about parties and wine events, came into the storage building one day and said, Mom says you vanish a lot lately.
Should I tell her you're hiding?
Grace smiled like it was nothing. I'm showing David how the property grew over time, she said, rolling out an old map. Dad doubled production in the 2000s, remember? Chloe looked from Grace to David and lingered a little too long. When she left, David's smile faded.
We're running out of cover, he said. Grace nodded.
Then we do it at the Harvest Gala, she said. Everyone will be out there, dressed up, drinking, showing off. If I create a big enough wine emergency, both my parents will rush to the tanks. That's your window to get into Dad's office. David raised an eyebrow.
You've really thought about this. Grace gave a small, hard smile. I've been fixing their problems for 12 years. I know exactly what scares them.
The night of the gala was perfect. Lanterns, live music, rich people laughing under the sunset. Grace moved through the crowd in a simple dress, nodding, smiling, waiting. When she saw her father talking to a group of investors and her mother working the room like a queen, she slipped away to the fermentation room and found Kyle, their head wine guy.
Kyle, I need you, she said, urgent.
I think Tank 7 is warming up.
His eyes widened.
That's the reserve batch.
Exactly. Please go get my parents. Tell them it's bad.
Within minutes, Robert and Clara came storming in. What is this? Robert snapped. That tank is worth $50,000, Grace said, pointing at the monitor she had already adjusted. If this spreads, the whole vintage is at risk.
Clara narrowed her eyes.
And this couldn't wait. Do you want vinegar or wine?
Grace shot back. That did it. They stayed. They argued. They tested.
They lectured.
Outside, the gala went on.
Inside, Grace kept them busy with numbers and possible contamination. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, David's signal. He was in. While Grace held her parents in the fermentation room, David slipped down the hall to Robert's office. He'd watched the lock for days. It opened the way he expected. Inside, the office smelled like old wood and expensive whiskey. He went straight to the filing cabinet behind the desk. Come on, he muttered. He found the year, 25 years earlier.
Restructuring. Share transfer. Pesticide reports.
He began snapping photos with his phone, fake maintenance logs for the tractor, letters about buying banned chemicals, a life insurance change on Samuel Croft just 2 weeks before his death.
Then he heard footsteps. Someone was coming down the hall.
David shoved the folder back, smoothed the dust, and slipped behind the door just as it opened. Robert stepped in, frowning, like something felt off. He checked the desk, checked a drawer, looked at the cabinet. David held his breath. Then, from the hall, Chloe's voice called, "Dad, Mom needs you back at the tanks."
Robert swore and walked out again.
David waited 5 full seconds, then slipped out and headed for the back of the property with the evidence on his phone. They met that night in the hidden perfume room, breathing hard from nerves. David connected his phone to an old laptop so they could see everything on a bigger screen. "Look," he said, scrolling. "Your father bought chemicals that were already flagged.
Your mother paid a lab to change soil results.
And this," he tapped a document, "is the fake transfer of Samuel Croft's 60%. The signature is dated after the notary was in the hospital."
Grace stared at the screen. "So it's all real," she whispered.
"They really did it."
David looked at her carefully.
"This is enough to take to the sheriff," he said. "But if we go now, they'll say it's all forged.
We need their voices. We need them to say it."
Grace looked up, eyes steady. "Then we make them say it.
Somewhere they can't pretend it's a misunderstanding."
David nodded slowly. "The old equipment shed," he said. "Where the tractor still is."
Grace's mouth tightened.
"Where Samuel died." "Exactly," David said. "We bring them there.
We show them what we know.
We record everything." The next evening the air was cool, smelling of dust and grapes.
Grace paced the old shed, heart pounding.
The rusted tractor sat in the corner like a ghost. David checked his phone again. "Recording is set," he said. "Once they walk in, don't let them shift the topic." Grace had already called her father, pretending to be worried.
"Dad, I thought I saw someone near the old shed. Can you come?"
"I don't want workers wandering back here with equipment."
Of course he didn't want outsiders near old secrets. He said he'd come.
She knew her mother would come too. Clara never let Robert handle image problems alone. Headlights flashed through the dirty window.
"They are here," David said.
The door opened and Clara walked in first, heels wrong for the dirt floor, eyes sharp. "What is this, Grace?" she demanded. Robert came in behind her, already angry. "We have guests.
Why are we out here?"
Grace stood straighter.
"This isn't about guests," she said.
"It's about Samuel Croft."
The name hit them like a stone. Robert froze. Clara's eyes narrowed to slits. "We are not doing this," Clara said.
"That man died in an accident."
David stepped out from the shadows. "No," he said calmly.
"He was killed."
For a moment, no one spoke.
Then Robert snarled, "You broke into my office." David held up his phone.
"I found the fake tractor logs.
The banned pesticide orders. The life insurance change. And the share transfer you forged after he was dead." Clara's face went cold, not scared, but calculating. "Grace, whatever this man has told you, he didn't tell me," Grace cut in.
"I found the lab. I saw his journals.
He wanted to make perfume from this land, just like I did. You erased him. You tried to erase me."
Robert's mouth twisted. He was going to ruin us, he burst out. He wanted expensive organic changes. We were drowning.
He was going to sell his shares to outsiders. David moved beside the tractor, letting the light hit the cut brake lines still visible. So you cut the brakes, he said.
And you pushed him.
Clara exhaled slowly, like she was tired of pretending.
One push, she said.
One push and the family was safe.
Grace stared at her.
Safe, she whispered. You killed a man to save money. David lifted his phone so they could see the red recording light.
Robert's face drained.
You recorded us.
David's voice was steady. You killed my grandfather. And you tried to bury his work.
Now the police will hear it. The next morning, Grace and David sat in Sheriff Harris's office.
The room was small, filled with old photos of the town.
Sheriff Harris listened without interrupting as they laid out the papers, the photos, and finally the audio. When Clara's voice came through, one push and the family was safe, the sheriff's jaw tightened. You're telling me the owners of Martin Estate killed their partner 25 years ago to take his land? He asked.
Yes, Grace said.
And then they tried to make me marry out of debt to cover years of bad decisions.
David slid the folder forward. All the dates match. The false reports. The sudden transfer. The chemical purchases. It's all there.
Sheriff Harris nodded once, slow.
All right, he said.
We'll bring them in. They drove back to the vineyard in separate cars, Sheriff in front, Grace and David behind.
No sirens. No drama.
Just steady, official movement. Workers paused in the yard as the sheriff walked up the steps. Grace felt her stomach twist.
She had lived her whole life in that house. Now she was bringing the law to its front door.
Robert and Clara were in the main office, as if they already knew something was coming. Clara stood behind the desk like it was a shield. Robert had his phone in his hand, angry. We'll handle this through our lawyers, he said.
Sheriff Harris didn't blink.
Robert Martin, Clara Martin, he said, you are under arrest for the murder of Samuel Croft. Clara laughed once, sharp. This is ridiculous.
Grace stepped forward.
You confessed, Mom, she said quietly. On tape. Robert tried to lunge at David, but one of the deputies stopped him. Outside, workers gathered, watching in silence.
Some of the older ones had known Samuel.
One of them, Miguel, lifted his chin at Grace, not smiling, just acknowledging. As her parents were walked out, Clara turned and hissed, You foolish girl. Everything we did was for this vineyard.
Grace met her eyes. Then you should have let it live clean, she said.
The patrol cars rolled away, slow and heavy. By evening, the news vans were outside the gates. Vineyard owners arrested for 25-year-old murder.
The peace didn't last long. The next morning, David got the call.
They made bail, he told Grace, jaw clenched.
$5 million.
Someone still owes them favors. Grace laughed once, tired. So to them it's still a business problem, she said. Exactly, David said. 2 days later, Clara arrived at the guest house alone, holding a bottle of old wine.
A little talk, darling, she said sweetly.
David's eyes narrowed. We shouldn't let her in.
Grace shook her head. No. We face her.
Clara came in, set the bottle down, started to open it.
Trials are messy, she said. Juries are strange.
Maybe we don't have to let it go that far.
David watched her hands. You brought us wine, he asked.
How thoughtful. Clara smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You always liked this vintage. Later, tests would show the wine was poisoned.
That was the final nail.
It turned a strong case into an airtight one, not just past murder, but a new attempt. In court, months later, Grace sat very straight while Judge Allison read the sentence. 30 years, no possibility of early release, the judge said. The evidence shows a planned killing, falsified business records, and an attempted poisoning to silence witnesses. Robert stared ahead, face blank. Clara's mouth was tight, no longer perfect. Grace didn't feel joy. She felt something heavier, like setting down a box she'd carried since childhood. David reached for her hand. We did it, he whispered. Outside, they got another call. Chloe was gone. She had entered a secret account and flown out of the country. She was never going to stay and face it, Grace said softly. She liked the parties, not the truth. The workers stayed. Neighboring vineyards offered help. The community, once afraid of the Martins, started treating Grace and David like people who had cleaned rotten roots. That night, walking through the vines at sunset, David said, "Now it's really yours." Grace looked over the land, the same land her parents had killed to keep.
"No," she said slowly. "It was his first. Samuel's."
In the weeks after the sentencing, the house felt different. No more sudden footsteps in the hallway. No more sharp voices calling Grace to come explain this. She and David moved into the main wing, not because they loved the big rooms, but because it was practical. People needed to see someone in charge. The workers came to her now, about equipment, about school fees, about the harvest schedule. Grace answered every question calmly. David handled the lawyers, the press, and the paperwork that proved Samuel Croft had once owned 60%. One evening, sitting at the long dining table that finally felt peaceful, Grace said, "This place was held together by fear. I don't want to run it like that." David looked at her. "How do you want to run it?" he asked. She turned the old perfume notebook toward him. "With truth," she said. "And with the thing he saw. This land is more than wine." But the more they looked at the books, the clearer it became. The vineyard could survive, but carrying the name Martin would always carry the story of murder. The press wouldn't let it go. Old partners kept asking careful questions. Even employees said, "We're with you, but the world may not forget." One night, walking through the rows at sunset, Grace stopped and said, "What if we don't keep it?" David slowed. "Sell the whole estate." She nodded. "We sell it. We pay back what should have been yours. Samuel's 60% goes to the Croft Trust. And my 40%, she smiled, a real smile this time. We start the Samuel Croft Foundation for Sustainable Farming. We help vineyards that don't want to cut corners. We help workers' families. We turn the ugly part of this story into something good. David was quiet for a moment, watching her. "Your parents tried to control you with a marriage," he said. "And you ended up deciding the future of the whole estate." Grace shrugged lightly. "That's what happens when you tell the worker daughter she's not important." Selling such a famous property was not quiet. Brokers called. Neighboring vineyard owners called. News outlets called. But this time, Grace led the talks. Not Robert. Not Clara. She set conditions. The new owner must keep the workers for at least 2 years. The land must not be stripped. The old hidden lab would stay sealed or be turned into a small museum for Samuel's work. People were surprised at how firm she was. "I kept this place alive while smiling people drank it," she told one potential buyer. "I won't watch you ruin it now." David watched her handle every detail with the precision she used to use on soil reports. When the sale finally went through, money moved exactly how she said it should. 60% into the Croft Trust, 40% into the new foundation. The headline wasn't Fallen Family anymore, it became Air Clean's Murder Legacy and Funds Green Farming. David laughed when he read it. "You rewrote the ending," he said. Grace answered, "No. I finally wrote my part." Months later, the foundation office was small but bright, with pictures of vineyards on the walls and a framed copy of one of Samuel's perfume pages. Farmers from nearby counties began to come in. Some needed help switching to safer methods. Some needed money for proper soil tests so they wouldn't be tempted to cheat. Grace explained things in simple language. The same way she used to talk to workers in the field. "If the land is sick, the people will be too," she would say. "We don't save money by poisoning the ground." David handled the legal side, making sure no one could ever twist this foundation into something ugly. Sometimes, when it was quiet, Grace would open Samuel's old notebook and try another version of the vineyard perfume she had dreamed of. This time, no one told her it was childish. David would pass by, smell it, and say, he would have been proud. And for the first time in her life, Grace believed it. On the 1-year mark of her parents' sentencing, Grace drove back to the old vineyard hill at sunset. The rows were still there, now under new owners, still green, still beautiful, proof that land can outlive bad people. David stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Do you miss it?" he asked. Grace thought about the girl in the white dress who felt like property. She thought about the hidden lab, the rusted tractor, the recording in the shed, the moment the workers nodded at her. "I don't miss belonging to it," she said. "I like us owning our choices instead." She turned to him. "Your grandfather was right. This land had more to give than wine. My parents tried to bury him, and in doing that, they buried their own future." David smiled.
And you dug it back up. Grace took his hand. Below them, the vines glowed gold in the light. The murder was no longer the last chapter.
The last chapter was this: a stolen legacy returned, a dirty history cleaned, and a woman who was once traded like a tool now deciding where every root would grow.